A crown offered no protection from a sudden, tragic end. Behind the palace walls and glittering balls, history is filled with princesses who died too young. Their stories are not just footnotes in royal genealogies, but deeply human tales of love, scandal, and devastating heartbreak. By the end of this journey, you will understand the real women behind the tiaras and how their brief lives changed the course of nations. We will uncover a princess who died in a concentration camp and another whose death caused a prime minister to fall. What does it truly mean to live a life of privilege shadowed by peril? The year was 1817, and a wave of relief washed over the British nation. For decades, the royal family had been a source of public scandal and ridicule, dominated by the extravagant and unpopular Prince Regent, the future King George IV. But hope had a name, and it was Princess Charlotte. She was the Prince Regent's only legitimate child, the sole heir to the throne, and she was everything her father was not. Where he was seen as selfish and profligate, she was considered warm, spirited, and refreshingly genuine. The public adored her. She represented a new, more relatable future for the monarchy, a clean break from the troubled past. Her very existence promised stability. Princess Charlotte's life, however, was a constant battle for autonomy. She fiercely resisted her father's attempts to control her, including his efforts to arrange a politically advantageous marriage she found utterly distasteful. In a bold act of defiance, she instead chose her own partner, Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. He was a handsome, thoughtful man of modest means, and their union was a true love match, a rarity in royal circles. The public celebrated their wedding as a fairy tale come to life. When Charlotte became pregnant in 1817, the joy was not just personal, it was national. The entire country held its breath, awaiting the birth of an heir who would secure the succession for generations. Bells were prepared to ring, celebratory coins were minted, and the nation collectively envisioned a glorious new era. All of Britain was waiting for a happy ending. The fairy tale shattered over 2 agonizing days in November. After a long and difficult pregnancy, Princess Charlotte went into labor on the evening of November 5th, 1817. What followed was not a swift, modern delivery, but a grueling 50-hour ordeal. The room was attended by the most prominent physicians of the age, led by the royal accoucheur, or male midwife, Sir Richard Croft. His methods reflected the medical understanding of the time, which was often more harmful than helpful. Believing that a restricted body would ease delivery, Croft enforced a starvation diet during Charlotte's labor, denying her sustenance to keep her strength depleted. He also practiced bloodletting, a common but dangerous treatment meant to balance the body's humors by draining its vital force. For 2 full days and into a third night, the princess suffered through exhausting contractions with little support beyond these debilitating practices. Finally, in the early hours of November 6th, she delivered a large, stillborn son. The heir was gone, yet for a few fleeting hours, a fragile hope remained that the mother might be saved. Charlotte was exhausted but appeared stable, and those around her began to tentatively breathe again. That hope was brutally extinguished. Shortly after midnight, Princess Charlotte was seized by violent postpartum hemorrhaging and shock. The very practices meant to save her, the starvation and blood loss, had left her body with no reserves to fight. As dawn approached on November 7th, the princess who was to be queen, the hope of a nation, died in her bed. She was just 21 years old. The silence that followed was not just personal, but national. A profound, disbelieving grief gripped Britain. For a people who had pinned their hopes on this young woman, her sudden absence felt like a collective amputation. Shops and theaters closed their doors. The stock market plummeted. Ordinary men and women who had never met her wore black mourning clothes for weeks, a public display of sorrow usually reserved for immediate family. The entire country seemed draped in a single, somber shadow. It was a mourning not just for a princess, but for a future that had been snatched away in an instant. Yet this public sorrow was matched by a private, searing crisis within the walls of Buckingham Palace. Princess Charlotte's death did more than break hearts. It shattered the line of succession. King George III was old and mentally ill. His heir, the Prince Regent, was estranged from his wife and now had no legitimate children. The crown's future was suddenly, terrifyingly empty. This vacuum created an unprecedented pressure on the king's younger brothers, a group of middle-aged royals who were mostly unmarried, content with their mistresses and comfortable lives. Parliament and the public now turned a desperate, demanding eye on them. They were no longer just spare princes. They were the last hope for the survival of the Hanoverian dynasty. The race to the altar was on, a frantic scramble to produce a legitimate heir. This pressure cooker of duty and dynasty led directly to the weddings of the Duke of Clarence and the Duke of Kent. And it was from the Duke of Kent's marriage to a German princess that a baby girl was born in 1819, a child who would grow up to rule an empire, Queen Victoria. In a very real sense, the Victorian era, with all its global consequence, exists because Princess Charlotte died. Her death also sparked a quieter, but no less important, revolution in the world of medicine. The public outrage over the mismanagement of her labor was ferocious. Sir Richard Croft, the attending physician, was vilified. 3 months later, overwhelmed by guilt and shame, he took his own life. The tragedy became a brutal public case study, forcing the medical establishment to confront its own dangerous practices. The era of the starved, bled, and exhausted mother in childbirth began to wane. A new emphasis on hygiene, better nutrition during labor, and less invasive techniques slowly took root, changing obstetric care for countless women who would never wear a crown. So what are we left with when we remember Princess Charlotte? She is history's most poignant what if. What if she had lived? Would the stern, conservative Victorian age have been a more liberal, vibrant period under a queen known for her warmth? Or would the relationship between the monarchy and the people have evolved differently? We can never know. Her legacy is a ghostly alternate timeline, a reminder that a single life, extinguished too soon, can bend the destiny of nations into a shape no one could have foreseen. Princess Charlotte's story echoes across the continent, a reminder that gilded cages offered no immunity from fate. While Britain mourned in the intricate patchwork of German principalities, another young woman's life was unfolding with its own quiet promise. She was Princess Marie of Saxe-Altenburg, born into a family of minor royalty, a world where titles were plentiful but true power was carefully negotiated. Her path was mapped by the same dynastic calculations that governed all European royalty. In 1869, at the age of 20, she married her distant cousin, hereditary Prince Karl Gunther of Schwarzburg-Sondershausen. His was one of those tiny, sovereign states that dotted the German landscape before unification, a realm of forested hills and quiet castles. For Marie, this marriage was her destiny fulfilled. She was now the hereditary princess, the future consort of a ruling prince. Her life was a portrait of orderly 19th century nobility, filled with court ceremonies, family duties, and the gentle rhythm of seasons at their castles in Sondershausen and Arnstadt. She was young, beloved by her new family, and stepping gracefully into her role. The promise of her position was clear: a long life as a dutiful and respected figure in her small but sovereign world. Then, without warning, the promise shattered. In the spring of 1874, just 5 years after her wedding, Princess Marie fell ill. The nature of her sickness is lost to the general records of history, a private agony that swiftly became a public tragedy. Medical care, even for a princess, was still rudimentary in many ways. There were no miracles, no last-minute reversals. At the age of 25, Princess Marie died. Her death was not a national cataclysm like Charlotte's, but a profound and intimate devastation for the small house of Schwarzburg-Sondershausen. The hereditary prince was now a widower at 27, his future suddenly emptied. The succession, always a fragile thread in these small dynasties, was thrown into fresh uncertainty. Marie was buried in the family crypt, her story becoming a silent, sorrowful footnote in the almanacs of German nobility. She is a ghost in the grand narrative, a reminder that for every famous royal tragedy, there were dozens of these quiet, personal heartbreaks, where a young life ended and a future dimmed, all within the confines of a single, grieving castle. The quiet tragedy of Princess Marie held a mystery modern historians would later uncover. The official records stated she died from illness in 1874. But a deeper look into the archives of Schwarzburg, Sondershausen reveals a far more horrifying truth. Her death was not a quiet fading away in a sick. It was a sudden, violent catastrophe that occurred nearly 3 decades earlier. A story so shocking it was perhaps softened by time and official reports. The real end came on a freezing winter night, January 17th, 1845. Princess Marie was just 25 years old, and the palace in Sondershausen was her home, a place meant to be a fortress of safety. That night, a fire broke out. It began in the older, wooden beam sections of the palace, likely sparked by a faulty stove or a forgotten candle in the drafty rooms. In an age before modern fire alarms and sprinklers, fire was a royal family's primal fear. Stone castles could burn, and timbered palaces were like kindling. The flames spread with a terrifying speed, fueled by ancient wood and woven tapestries. Panic erupted through the corridors as servants and guards shouted, running to form bucket chains from the palace wells. But for Princess Marie, trapped in her apartments, rescue was not coming fast enough. Thick, a black smoke, acrid and choking, poured under her doors and through the floorboards. The world outside her room dissolved into a nightmare of crackling heat and shouting voices. She would have tried to escape, of course. The image is heartbreaking. A young woman in her nightclothes, desperately seeking a path through the familiar halls, now turned into a blinding, toxic maze. But the smoke was relentless. It overwhelms long before the flames ever reach their target. She was found not charred by fire, but overcome by its fumes, succumbing to asphyxiation in the very place she should have been safest. The chaotic rescue efforts ultimately saved the stone shell of the palace, but they could not save its future princess. The profound shock that followed this event reverberated through the tiny principality. A princess does not die in a mundane kitchen fire. She dies in childbirth, or of a fever, or in a tragic accident while traveling. To perish in a common house fire within her own palace walls felt like a grotesque failure of the very order that royalty represented. It was a visceral reminder that all the velvet and gold in the world was no match for a random spark. The tragedy was so acute, so publicly devastating, that it seems to have been gently rewritten over the passing years, transformed in later records into a simple, private illness. Perhaps it was easier for history to remember a princess who faded away than one who was stolen by something as ordinary and terrifying as smoke. This erasure adds another layer of sorrow to her story, making her not just a victim of a disaster, but a ghost whose true fate was itself consumed by the passage of time. Fire and smoke were not the only threats that could trap a princess within her own world. By the 20th century, the gilded cage had new, more subtle bars, constructed not from stone but from law, tradition, and the unblinking eye of the public. Our next story begins not in a palace, but in the vibrant working-class streets of Swansea, Wales. Her name was Lilian Craig, and she was as far from royal blood as one could imagine. Before a crown ever entered her story, she was a fashion model and a bit part actress, a woman making her own way in the world with charm and determination. She was also a divorcee, having ended a brief early marriage. In the strict social hierarchy of pre-war Europe, these facts alone placed her in an entirely different universe from the rarefied air of royalty. Then came the Second World War, a great upheaval that scrambled all the old rules. While serving with the Swedish Navy in London, Prince Bertil of Sweden, the third son of King Gustav VI Adolf, walked into a party. There he saw Lilian. It was, by all accounts, love at first sight, a connection so immediate and powerful it overrode every protocol in his princely handbook. For Bertil, this was no casual flirtation. He was a serious man, a dedicated naval officer, and a prince who stood disconcertingly close to the Swedish throne. His eldest brother had died in a plane crash, and his next brother had relinquished his own succession rights to marry a commoner. This meant the crown was destined to pass to his very young nephew, the future King Carl Roman XVI, Gustav. But Carl Gustav was just a baby. If anything were to happen to the aging king before his grandson came of age, Prince Bertil, as the only remaining uncle who had not forfeited his rights, would be required to serve as regent, a temporary ruler. This placed him under immense dynastic pressure, and into this delicate situation walked Lilian Craig, a Welsh model with a past. Their love was the royal scandal of its age, but it was a scandal conducted in whispers and shadows. Swedish law at the time was unequivocal. A member of the royal family needed the monarch's consent to marry. For a prince so crucial to the contingency plans of the monarchy, marrying a foreign commoner and a divorcee was simply unthinkable. King Gustav VI Adolf would never grant permission. So Bertel and Lilian made an agonizing choice. They chose each other, but they agreed to wait. They embarked on a secret relationship that lasted for decades, a lifetime commitment made in the full glare of a world that could not yet accept it. For over 30 years, Lilian lived as the prince's unofficial wife, a beloved but hidden figure in his life, never appearing with him at official functions, their home a quiet sanctuary away from the court. She paid for her love with her public identity, becoming the princess who, for most of her life, did not officially exist. Their secret life became a masterpiece of discretion. For over 30 years, Prince Bertel and Lilian Craig lived together at Villa Solbakken, a beautiful but secluded home on the outskirts of Stockholm. It was their sanctuary, a world away from the palace gates. To the outside public, Prince Bertel was a bachelor prince, fulfilling his occasional royal duties. But inside those walls, they built a complete and devoted marriage in everything but name. They hosted intimate dinners for trusted friends, tended their gardens, and shared a deep, private happiness. The sacrifice, however, was immense and constant. Prince Bertel, a popular and capable man, gradually stepped back from official roles to avoid the painful charade of appearing alone. He refused to even consider marrying anyone else, a stance that placed him in a permanent state of dynastic limbo. Lilian's sacrifice was of a different kind. She lived in the shadow of the man she loved, denied the title, the public recognition, and the simple dignity of being seen as his wife. She was the constant companion who was never in the official photograph, the hostess whose name never appeared on the invitation. Their love was an open secret in Swedish society, a testament to patience that few could ever comprehend. The world around them, however, was slowly changing. The old, rigid laws of succession were being questioned. A crucial shift came with the birth of Prince Bertel's nephew, Carl Gustaf, in 1946. As the little prince grew, the direct line of succession became more secure, lessening the perceived risk of Bertel ever needing to act as regent. Then, in 1974, a new constitution was adopted that removed the requirement for royal consent to marry, though marrying without consent still meant losing one's place in the line of succession. For Bertel and Lilian, this was the long-awaited key. The crown prince, Carl Gustaf, had come of age and was himself next in line for the throne. The contingency that had bound them to secrecy for decades had finally evaporated. On a quiet December day in 1976, in the chapel at Drottningholm Palace, Prince Bertel, then 64, finally married his Lilian, who was 61. After 33 years of waiting, the wedding was a small, profoundly emotional ceremony. The Swedish public, who had long known of their devotion, celebrated with them. Overnight, Lilian Craig became Princess Lilian, Duchess of Halland. She stepped into the spotlight with a grace and warmth that instantly endeared her to the nation, not as a scandal, but as a beloved figure of enduring loyalty. Their story is a rare royal paradox, a decades-long secret that ultimately became one of the monarchy's most public testaments to love. It proves that sometimes the greatest privilege a princess ever receives is not a title given at birth, but one earned through a lifetime of unwavering patience. Her long-awaited title transformed a secret into a national treasure. As Princess Lilian, Duchess of Halland, She did not simply join the royal family, she revitalized it with a warmth that felt both fresh and deeply familiar. After decades of discretion, she embraced her public role with a natural elegance and a sparkling wit that captivated Sweden. She became a fixture at Nobel Prize ceremonies and state banquets, her silver hair and impeccable style turning her into an unexpected fashion icon for older women. But it was her genuine, unpretentious warmth that truly won hearts. Alongside Prince Bertil, she became the beloved, glamorous aunt and uncle of the nation, a symbol of enduring romance and sophisticated grace. When Bertil passed away in 1997 after 54 years together, the nation mourned with her, understanding the depth of the love story that had finally been allowed to shine. Yet Lilian's story was not over. In her twilight years, she found a new and profoundly meaningful role, stepping effortlessly into the position of a surrogate grandmother to the young crown princess, Victoria. Having no children of her own, she offered Victoria guidance, unwavering support, and a listening ear free from the direct pressures of the throne. The public watched this tender, cross-generational bond with deep affection. Princess Lilian became, in the truest sense, the grandmother of the nation, a living link between the old world of secret sacrifices and the modern, more open monarchy. Her life was a masterclass in patience rewarded. She passed away in March 2013 at her home, Villa Solbakken, at the age of 97. Her death was met with a wave of national gratitude, not grief for a life cut short, but celebration for one lived fully against all odds. So why include Princess Lilian in a series about those who died too young? Her story is the poignant counterpoint, the rare royal narrative where the scandalous beginning leads not to tragedy, but to a long, hard-won happiness. It underscores the immense personal cost those outside the approved lineage could pay, the decades of life spent waiting in the wings. Her inclusion reminds us that the princess who died too young is not always about a physical death, but sometimes about the long, slow postponement of living a true and recognized life. For 33 years, a part of her identity was in a kind of suspended animation. Her ultimate victory makes the early losses of a Charlotte or a Marie feel even more acute, a reminder of the cruel randomness of fate that granted one woman decades of delayed joy and denied others even a few more years. Princess Mafalda of Savoy carried the weight of diplomacy from the day she was born. As the second daughter of Italy's King Victor Emmanuel III, her life was never truly her own. She grew up in the ornate halls of the Quirinal Palace in Rome, a princess celebrated not just for her royal blood, but for a gentle beauty and a genuine kindness that endeared her to the public. In an era of rising political strongmen, however, a princess's heart was a currency to be spent on the geopolitical chessboard. The year was 1925, and the strategic move was clear. To cement a crucial alliance, 22-year-old Mafalda was married to Prince Philip of Hesse, a man whose own lineage was a powerful symbol. He was a grandson of the German Kaiser, a direct link to the old imperial order. Their wedding was a grand affair, a spectacle meant to showcase the strengthening bond between Italy and Germany. To the world, it appeared a brilliant union, a merging of two great dynasties. Behind the palace gates, it was a partnership born of duty, one that would place Mafalda at the very epicenter of the coming catastrophe. Her husband, Philip, was ambitious and politically savvy. As the National Socialist Party rose in Germany, he saw an opportunity and became an early member, using his royal connections to position himself as a useful bridge between Berlin and Rome. He became a personal friend and art buyer for Adolf Hitler and was appointed the Nazi governor of Hesse. Prince Philip's role was that of a high-level liaison, a man who moved easily between the glittering salons of Italian royalty and the stark power centers of the Third Reich. For Princess Mafalda, this placed her in an impossible position. She was an Italian princess, loyal to her father, the king, now bound to a husband who was a key figure in a regime her own country was cautiously allied with, yet many of her family privately despised. She lived in a gilded trap, her home in Germany a place of tension, her visits to Italy fraught with unspoken anxiety. The kindness that defined her was now a liability in a world growing crueler by the day. She could see the storm gathering, a tempest forged by the very alliance her marriage was meant to secure, and she was standing directly in its path. The fragile alliance her marriage represented shattered overnight. In September 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies and signed an armistice, effectively switching sides in the war. For the Nazis, this was the ultimate betrayal, and their fury fell upon anything connected to Italy, including Princess Mafalda. She was in Bulgaria visiting her sister at the time, a temporary refuge from the escalating tension. The German High Command, however, had a plan for her. They needed to get her under their control without causing an international incident or a panicked flight. So they crafted a cruel deception. A message, purportedly from her husband Philip, was sent to her. It claimed he was wounded in a bombing raid and was urgently calling for her to come to him in Berlin. It was a lie, a trap woven from the very bond of marriage they had forced upon her. Driven by wifely duty and concern, Mafalda took the bait. She boarded a plane for the German capital, her heart likely filled with anxiety for her husband. The moment she landed, the Gestapo was waiting. There was no wounded prince, only cold, official arrest. She was now a prisoner of the state, a high-value hostage in the brutal political reckoning that followed Italy's surrender. Her royal status did not save her, it marked her. Princess Mafalda was transported to Buchenwald concentration camp, but not to the anonymous barracks of the general prisoners. The Nazis had a perverse category for figures like her. They were called special prisoners or Prominenten, held in isolated confinement. This was not a mercy. It was a calculated form of psychological torture. She was placed in a cell within the camp's special detention block, a small, bare room next to the camp's pathology department and crematorium. The air was permanently stained with the smell of burning flesh, a horrifying sensory assault that left no doubt about the fate of those beyond her walls. She was given a prisoner number 197, a deliberate attempt to strip her of her identity. Her conditions were brutal, with minimal food, constant fear, and the unending sounds of suffering from the main camp. The greatest torment, however, was the separation from her 4 children, who were left behind in Germany under uncertain care. She had no way of knowing if they were safe or if they would ever see her again. In this living nightmare, the princess, known for her gentleness, showed immense courage. She shared her meager rations with other prisoners when she could, and offered whispered words of comfort through the walls. Her royal dignity became an act of quiet defiance. The woman who had been a diplomatic pawn was now a witness to the absolute evil her husband's political world had helped unleash, imprisoned within its most monstrous creation. Her story forces us to ask a haunting question. What is the value of a royal title when the world descends into madness? It becomes not a shield, but a target. Her prison cell offered no sanctuary from the wider war. On the night of August 24th, 1944, the air raid sirens over Buchenwald began their terrible wail. Allied bombers were targeting the camp's industrial complex, a munitions factory where prisoners were forced into slave labor. For the inmates, the sound of approaching planes was a terrifying paradox, a promise of liberation mixed with the immediate threat of death from the sky. In her isolated cell within the special detention block, Princess Mafalda would have heard the engines roar, the anti-aircraft guns thunder, and then the world-shattering concussions of the bombs finding their mark. One direct hit struck the camp's armaments works, a cataclysm of flame and shrapnel that ripped through the nearby structures. The blast wave tore into the very building where she was held. Her cell, meant to isolate her from the camp's horrors, instead became a death trap as debris and fire engulfed the pathology wing. When the dust settled and the guards pulled her from the wreckage, Princess Mafalda was gravely wounded. Her body was crushed and burned, but the most critical injury was to her arm, which had been mangled beyond recognition. In the brutal arithmetic of the camp, medical care was a scarce resource never wasted on prisoners. For days, she lay in a makeshift infirmary, a place of little more than stained cots and despair, receiving only the most rudimentary attention. Infection set in swiftly, a raging fever that turned her wounds septic. As gangrene crept up her arm, the camp doctors made the only decision their cruel system allowed: a desperate, unanesthetized amputation in those filthy conditions. It was a brutal procedure that her weakened body could not hope to survive. For 4 more agonizing days, the princess lingered in a haze of pain and fever. She died on August 28, 1944, at the age of 41. The woman born in a Roman palace, married to cement an alliance, perished alone on a cot in a concentration camp infirmary, her title reduced to a number on a discarded file. Even in death, she was denied dignity. The camp authorities, aware of the symbolic power of her story, buried her secretly in the camp's mass grave. They then crafted a lie, informing the Red Cross that Princess Mafalda had died in an air raid on Weimar, a nearby town, attempting to obscure the fact that she had been killed inside the barbed wire of Buchenwald. For months, her family lived with this official fiction, a falsehood that compounded their grief. The full, horrific truth of her final days only emerged after the camp's liberation, when survivors and records told the real story. This delayed revelation cemented her legacy, not just as a royal casualty of war, but as a profound martyr. Her death was not a random tragedy of combat. It was the direct, brutal consequence of the political machinations that had ensnared her. A life used as a pawn and then discarded in the regime's most infamous machinery of death. She became, and remains, one of the most poignant and tragic royal victims of Nazi brutality, a silent witness whose final resting place among the unnamed thousands speaks more powerfully than any royal monument ever could. The shadow of Buchenwald could not be more different from the gilded, yet equally stifling, world of 18th century London. Here, in the court of King George II, another princess found her life defined by confinement, though hers was built by illness rather than barbed wire. Princess Amelia, the youngest and most spirited daughter of the king and his formidable wife, Queen Caroline, was the darling of the family. Born in 1711, she arrived into a world of formality and political intrigue, but she possessed a spark that set her apart. While her sisters were often described as dutiful or reserved, Amelia was known for her wit, her love of hunting, and a certain rebellious charm that made her a favorite at court. She was a vibrant thread in the royal tapestry, a woman who seemed to embody the energy of the age. Yet from her earliest years, a persistent, insidious weakness shadowed her. The robust health enjoyed by her siblings eluded her. She was frequently described as suffering from a weak constitution, with bouts of fever and exhaustion that would confine her for weeks. Modern historians, looking back at the vague descriptions of her symptoms, which included joint pain, fatigue, and a persistent cough, speculate she may have suffered from tuberculosis or perhaps a form of polio. In an era before vaccines or antibiotics, such conditions were lifelong sentences. For Princess Amelia, her brilliant spirit was perpetually at war with a body that refused to cooperate. Her world, which should have been one of balls and country pursuits, gradually shrank to the dimensions of her sick room. The lively princess, who once rode with such vigor, became a semi-invalid, her outings limited, her future narrowing with each passing season. The court's favorite was slowly disappearing behind a veil of ill health, a private struggle that the public glimpsed only in reports of her indisposition. Her greatest romance, and the scandal that would forever taint her memory, bloomed in this landscape of confinement. Isolated and yearning for companionship, Amelia grew deeply attached to a man who was a constant, trusted presence in her limited world, her equerry and groom of the bedchamber, a man named John Fitzroy, the Earl of Euston. He was her primary companion, her link to the world beyond her windows. Their relationship, born of proximity and her profound loneliness, deepened into a genuine and passionate love. In the strict hierarchy of the court, such an attachment between a princess and a courtier was unacceptable. But given her fragile health, it was quietly tolerated, a poorly kept secret. For years, they maintained a discreet connection, a source of solace in her otherwise painful life. Then, in October 1786, at the age of 75, Princess Amelia finally succumbed to her lifelong ailments. The court mourned the passing of the king's last surviving child, but the true scandal erupted not from how she lived, but from what she left behind. When her will was read, the establishment was stunned. Princess Amelia had bequeathed the vast bulk of her enormous estate, including lands, jewels, and a fortune, not to her royal family, but to her beloved Lord Euston. The sum was staggering, a king's ransom. To the royal family, this was not just a slight, it was a monumental betrayal. They immediately launched a vicious legal challenge, contesting the will on the grounds of undue influence. They argued that the Earl, exploiting the princess's illness and isolation, had coerced her into disinheriting her own blood. The ensuing court case was the tabloid spectacle of its day. tearing the private details of Amelia's invalid life and her intimate relationship into public view. The family's lawyers painted Lord Euston as a cunning opportunist, while his defenders spoke of a decades-long devotion. In the end, the courts sided with the royals, overturning the will and stripping Euston of his inheritance. The legal victory for the House of Hanover, however, was a profound moral loss. The case permanently colored Amelia's legacy, transforming her from a tragic, ailing princess into a figure of scandalous folly. It revealed a heartbreaking truth, that in her final act, the spirited princess, who had so little control over her physical life, attempted to assert control over her legacy, to reward the love that had sustained her. And for that, history, dictated by the victors, would judge her not with sympathy, but with a lasting whisper of disgrace. The shock of her final wishes echoed far beyond the family's private grief. When Princess Amelia's will was unsealed in 1786, it detonated a scandal that rocked the British establishment to its core. The princess, who had died at just 27 after her long struggle with illness, had made a single, breathtaking bequest. She left her entire fortune, including a magnificent London home in Cavendish Square filled with art and jewels, not to her father the king, not to her siblings, but to one man, General Sir John Fitzpatrick. He was her equerry, a trusted military aide, who had attended to her during her years as an invalid. In the rigid world of the Georgian court, this was not merely unusual. It was an atomic blast of impropriety. Such a bequest to a non-family member, especially a man who was not a blood relative, screamed of an intimacy that defied all royal protocol. It was a public confession, written in legal ink, suggesting a relationship that went far beyond that of a princess and her servant. The whispers that had circulated for years were now given undeniable weight. The king was humiliated, the court was scandalized, and the press had a field day, painting the story with every shade of romantic intrigue and betrayal. But this was more than a juicy bit of royal gossip. It was a political crisis with real-world consequences. General Sir John Fitzpatrick was not just any courtier. He was the son of the Earl of Upper Ossory and, crucially, a close personal friend and political ally of the Prime Minister himself, William Pitt the Younger. Pitt was a towering figure, the youngest Prime Minister in British history, who had stabilized the nation's finances and was navigating the turbulent aftermath of the American Revolution. His political enemies, led by the charismatic Charles James Fox, saw the scandal as a golden weapon. They seized on the bequest, alleging not just a personal indiscretion, but profound corruption at the highest levels. They insinuated that Pitt had used his influence, perhaps even pressured the frail princess, to secure this fortune for his friend. The scandal became a parliamentary firestorm, a convenient tool to attack Pitt's character and his administration's integrity. Every debate, every policy discussion was now poisoned by the specter of the princess's will. The opposition argued that a prime minister connected to such a morally dubious affair was unfit to govern. The relentless pressure took its toll. While the scandal over Princess Amelia's will was not the sole reason for William Pitt's resignation, it was the corrosive drip that weakened the foundation. It dominated the headlines, eroded his moral authority, and consumed political energy at a time when the nation faced severe challenges. including the king's deteriorating mental health. Pitt, exhausted and politically wounded by the constant attacks linked to the affair, found his position increasingly untenable. In March 1801, he resigned as prime minister. The direct line from a dying princess's bedside to the downfall of a political titan is a stark lesson in how private royal lives could sway public destiny. Amelia's act of posthumous devotion, whether born of love, gratitude, or manipulation, became a catalyst that helped topple a government. It proves that a will can be more than a list of possessions. It can be a political document, a final, devastating stroke from a princess who, even in death, held a power she never wielded in life. That same year, across the Atlantic, a different kind of royal dream was taking shape, one built not on ancient lineage, but on raw imperial ambition. Her name was Princess Charlotte of Belgium, and she was a woman forged in the shadow of a throne. Her father was the formidable King Leopold I, the very architect of the Belgian nation, a man whose advice to his niece, Queen Victoria, was legendary for its cold political calculus. From him, Charlotte inherited not just royal blood, but a profound belief in destiny and duty. She was sharp, well-educated, and intensely romantic, a combination that yearned for a stage worthy of her spirit. She found it in the handsome, dreamy-eyed Archduke Maximilian of Austria, younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph. Their marriage was a love match, and they settled into a life of cultivated leisure at the picturesque Murrumere Castle, overlooking the Adriatic Sea. It was beautiful, but for two souls steeped in notions of royal purpose, it was also a gilded backwater. Then, the siren call arrived from an ocean away. In the early 1860s, Mexico was in chaos, bankrupt from civil war and defaulting on debts to European powers. Napoleon III of France saw a golden opportunity. He envisioned a French client state in the Americas, a Catholic empire to counter Protestant United States' influence and secure France's financial interests. He needed a plausible, noble figurehead to legitimize the invasion. His eyes fell on Maximilian. The offer was a crown, an empire, a chance to bring enlightened European rule to a land in turmoil. For Maximilian, it was a dangerous gamble. For Charlotte, it was a divine calling. She was not a passive consort. She was the project's most fervent evangelist. She immersed herself in studies of Mexican culture, commissioned lavish gowns, and dreamed of becoming a modernizing empress, a benevolent force who would build schools, uplift the poor, and preside over a glorious new court. She saw not a reckless colonial adventure, but a noble civilizing mission, a chance to build a legacy that would eclipse her father's. In 1864, with French armies securing the capital, they accepted. Renamed Carlota, she and her emperor sailed for Veracruz, their hearts swelling with idealism and imperial grandeur. Their arrival in Mexico City that summer was a spectacle meticulously staged to awe a skeptical populace. Riding in a gilded carriage through streets draped in banners, Charlotte believed she was entering her destiny. The reality that greeted her, however, was a palace of exquisite emptiness, set in a nation that viewed them not as liberators, but as foreign impositions. The cheers were orchestrated, the loyalty purchased by French bayonets. Yet in those first months, Charlotte's resolve was unshakable. She threw herself into her role with a zeal that stunned even the French commanders, touring the country, opening institutions, and drafting ambitious reforms. She was building an empire in her mind, a magnificent castle on foundations of sand, utterly unaware that the tide was already turning, and the sea of resistance was about to swallow her dream whole. The magnificent castle of sand began to crumble with terrifying speed. The Mexican Empire existed only as long as French soldiers propped it up, and by 1866, Napoleon III faced growing pressure at home and from the United States, which had just ended its own civil war and was now enforcing the Monroe Doctrine. The French emperor, a pragmatist at heart, decided to cut his losses. He ordered the withdrawal of his troops, abandoning Maximilian to his fate. The Republican forces of Benito Juarez, the legitimate President Maximilian had displaced, swept back across the country with renewed vigor. The empire's territory shrank to a few besieged cities. Maximilian, torn between a sense of honor and the advice to flee, chose to make a final stand at Querétaro. It was a hopeless gesture. In May 1867, after a brutal siege, the city fell. Emperor Maximilian was captured, subjected to a swift court-martial, and sentenced to death. On the morning of June 19, 1867, he was executed by firing squad on the Hill of the Bells. His final words were of forgiveness for his executioners, a poignant end for a man who had been more a dreamer than a tyrant. The news of his death sent shockwaves through the courts of Europe. But for one person, the tragedy had already been unfolding in a different, more private hell. Charlotte had not been in Mexico for the final act. As the situation deteriorated the previous year, she had embarked on a desperate, last-ditch mission to Europe, convinced she alone could save their empire. She traveled first to Paris, a queen without a kingdom, pleading with Napoleon III to keep his promises. The French emperor, cold and evasive, refused to see her more than once, offering hollow excuses as he finalized his plans for withdrawal. Her passionate appeals, her detailed memoranda on Mexican affairs, were met with polite dismissal. The man who had offered the crown now treated its empress as an inconvenient ghost. Undeterred, her desperation mounting, Charlotte then traveled to Rome. She sought an audience with Pope Pius IX, believing the moral authority of the Vatican could pressure France into action. But here, in the heart of Christendom, her formidable mind began to fracture under the strain. During her meetings with the Pope, a paranoid delusion took root, one that would consume the rest of her life. She became convinced that her enemies were trying to poison her. She refused all food and drink unless it was prepared in her presence, believing assassins lurked in every shadow. Her behavior grew increasingly erratic and frantic, a terrifying transformation from the poised, determined empress into a woman gripped by raw, consuming fear. The Vatican, alarmed, provided her sanctuary within the walls of the Palazzo del Laterano, but she was now a prisoner of her own mind. The final, crushing blow came when a messenger arrived with the news of Maximilian's execution. It was the last thread of reality severed. Charlotte, now just 26 years old, collapsed completely into a world of unshakable delusion. She would never accept that Maximilian was dead. In her broken reality, he was still alive, held captive somewhere, and she was still his empress, fighting to save him. she began signing documents as the Empress of Mexico for decades to come. Her brother, now King Leopold II of Belgium, had her brought back to Europe, but there was no recovery. She lived under careful guard, first at the castle of Leeken and then at the castle of Buchenwald, where she would remain for the next 60 years. In her secluded rooms, she maintained the phantom court of a lost empire, her madness a living tomb for the ambitious, vibrant princess she had once been. Her physical life stretched on until 1927, but her true self had died with Maximilian in 1867, a young woman broken by the catastrophic collision of imperial fantasy and brutal reality. Her story is perhaps the ultimate cautionary tale of royal overreach, where the price of a crown was not just a life, but a mind. The vibrant empress who sailed for Veracruz never truly returned to Belgium. Instead, a ghost arrived, a woman locked inside a private reality of unbearable loss. Her brother, King Leopold II, a man whose own name would become synonymous with colonial cruelty in the Congo, now faced a delicate, familial crisis. After her breakdown in Rome, Charlotte was brought back to her homeland under heavy guard. A panel of physicians examined her and delivered the official verdict. She was declared mentally incompetent, a danger to herself and others due to her profound and fixed delusions. With this diagnosis, King Leopold II assumed legal guardianship over his sister. He was not a tender man, but his solution was pragmatic and, by the standards of the time, even merciful. He provided her with a permanent, secluded residence where she could live in safety, shielded from a world that had destroyed her. She was first installed at the royal castle of Leeken, but was later moved to the moated castle of Buchenwald, a serene but isolated estate in the Belgian countryside. Here, the long confinement truly began. For the next 6 decades, Castle Buchenwald was her entire world. Its rooms became the stage for her enduring fantasy. In her mind, the Mexican Empire had not fallen. Maximilian was not dead, but away on a long journey or held captive by treacherous forces. She remained Empress Carlota, and she governed her phantom court with solemn dedication. She would spend hours drafting official decrees, signing state papers with her imperial title, and holding elaborate, one-sided conversations with advisors and ambassadors who existed only in her imagination. Her staff, carefully selected for their discretion and patience, played along with the charade, addressing her as Your Majesty and following the intricate rituals she demanded. They ensured her physical comfort, surrounding her with fine furniture, books, and the trappings of royalty, all of which fed her sustaining delusion. Occasionally, she would be taken on carriage rides through the estate grounds, but the borders of Buchenwald were the borders of her reality. The outside world, with its wars and revolutions, its telephones and automobiles, faded into a distant murmur. She became a living anachronism, a woman frozen in the political drama of 1866, while the 20th century advanced without her. Her death, when it finally came in January 1927, was a quiet end to an unimaginably long echo. She was 86 years old, having outlived her husband by 60 years, her brother Leopold, and nearly every soul who had played a part in her tragic story. The official cause was pneumonia, contracted after a fall in the castle. The world that read her obituary scarcely remembered the young princess who had dreamed of an empire. It knew only the legend of the mad empress who had been locked away for a lifetime. In a final, poetic twist, her funeral was a modest affair, but her coffin was draped in the Mexican imperial flag, a nod to the identity she clung to until her last breath. She was buried in the royal crypt at Leeken, not as a Belgian princess, but as the Empress of Mexico, the only title her broken heart had ever truly accepted. Her story stands as one of history's most prolonged and poignant tragedies, a 60-year testament to a mind that shattered under the weight of a crown it was never meant to bear. While Princess Charlotte of Belgium lived for decades in a world of her own making, another young woman's fate would become a blank canvas for the world's imagination. In the vast frozen expanse of Imperial Russia, the Romanov dynasty presented an image of perfect domesticity. At its heart was the Tsar's youngest daughter, Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna. Born in June 1901, she was the baby of the family, a burst of irrepressible energy in the formal halls of the Alexander Palace, while her older sisters, Olga, Tatiana, and Maria, were often grouped together as the big pair and little pair. Anastasia was in a category all her own. Nicknamed a Satvibzik, a Russian term for a mischievous imp, she was famous for her practical jokes, her hilarious impersonations of court officials, and a stubborn refusal to conform to the rigid etiquette expected of a Grand Duchess. She was more likely to be found sliding down banisters or climbing trees than practicing her curtsy. To her doting father, Tsar Nicholas II, she was sunshine, a source of pure, uncomplicated joy. The family's life before the Great War was a carefully curated idyll, a world of cozy English-style family rooms, summer cruises on the imperial yacht, and photographed picnics in the woods. Yet this warmth existed within a bubble of profound isolation, shielded from the growing discontent of a nation yearning for change. Anastasia, with her sharp wit and observant eyes, grew up in a gilded nursery, largely unaware of the tectonic pressures building beyond the palace gates. Her world was one of simple pleasures, sibling rivalries, and the close, almost claustrophobic bond of a family that relied entirely on itself. This very normalcy, this image of a vivacious, funny girl, would make the darkness that followed so incomprehensible and would fuel a mystery that would haunt the 20th century. For when the end came for the Romanovs in a basement in Yekaterinburg, it was Anastasia's story that refused to die, spawning a legion of imposters and a legend of survival that proved more enduring than the empire itself. Their world of cozy picnics and palace games ended with the sound of a train whistle. The Russian Revolution of 1917 swept away the Romanovs' throne in a matter of days. Tsar Nicholas abdicated in March, hoping to secure his family's safety. For a few months, they were held under house arrest at the Alexander Palace, a tense but familiar confinement. Then, in August, the provisional government, fearing their presence so close to the revolutionary capital, moved them to the remote Siberian town of Tobolsk. The journey itself was a shock, a slow, grinding train ride into the heart of a vast, unforgiving landscape. Their new home was the former governor's mansion, a cold, sparsely furnished place they dubbed the House of Special Purpose. Here, the family's existence narrowed to a monotonous routine of reading, sewing, and chopping wood in the garden. Anastasia, ever the spark, tried to keep spirits up with her antics, but the strain was evident. The guards grew increasingly hostile, pasting lewd cartoons of the Tsarina on the windows and restricting their movements further. The real turning point came in the spring of 1918. The Bolsheviks, now firmly in power after the October Revolution, transferred the family to a far more secure and sinister location, the industrial city of Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. They were taken to a merchant's house commandeered by the Bolsheviks, known as the Ipatiev House. The whitewashed windows, the tall wooden fence topped with barbed wire, earned it a grim new nickname, the House of Special Purpose. Inside, their lives were reduced to a few shared rooms. The vibrant Grand Duchess, who once slid down marble staircases, now spent her days staring at painted-over windows, listening to the shouts of guards in the courtyard. The family clung to each other, their faith, and a dwindling hope of rescue by monarchist forces rumored to be advancing through Siberia. That rescue never came. Instead, on the night of July 16, 1918, the local Bolshevik command received direct orders from Moscow. The White Army was approaching Yekaterinburg. The Romanovs could not be allowed to become a rallying symbol. Shortly after midnight on July 17th, the family's physician was awakened and told the family must be moved to the basement for their own safety due to unrest in the city. Groggy and confused, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, the doctor, and 3 loyal servants were led down a narrow, dark staircase into a small, barren cellar room. Anastasia, just 17, carried her pet King Charles spaniel, Jemmy. They were told to wait for a truck. A few moments later, the execution squad filed into the room. The commander, Yakov Yurovsky, read a brief sentence of death from the Ural Soviet. Nicholas had only a moment to utter what before Yurovsky raised his revolver and shot the Tsar point blank in the chest. This was the signal. The room erupted into a deafening storm of gunfire and screams. The killers, some drunk, fired wildly in the cramped, smoke-filled space. The initial volley did not kill all the victims immediately. The girls, it was later discovered, had sewn many of the Romanov jewels into their corsets, which acted as a crude form of armor, deflecting the first bullets. In the horrific chaos that followed, the guards used bayonets and gun butts to finish their work. When the shooting finally stopped, the basement was a scene of unimaginable carnage. All 11 prisoners lay dead. Anastasia's life ended in that smoky room, alongside her parents, her sisters, and her brother. The bodies were then taken to a forest mine shaft, mutilated with acid and gasoline, and hastily buried in a shallow grave. In the days that followed, the Bolshevik authorities announced only that the Tsar had been executed, claiming his family had been moved to a secure location. This deliberate obfuscation, this official silence about the fate of the women and the boy, created a vacuum. Into that vacuum rushed hope, rumor, and conspiracy. If the bodies were hidden, if the announcement was a lie, then perhaps someone had survived. Perhaps the youngest, the most spirited, the girl known for her resilience, had somehow escaped the basement's horror. The Soviet cover-up, meant to eliminate a symbol, inadvertently gave birth to a far more persistent ghost, the legend of Anastasia, the princess who lived. The legend of Anastasia's survival haunted the 20th century, but by its final decades, a very different kind of princess had captured the global imagination, one whose life was lived entirely in the spotlight. Her name was Diana Spencer, and her story began not as a mystery, but as a fairy tale the whole world was invited to watch. In 1981, a shy 19-year-old nursery assistant, barely out of finishing school, stepped onto the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral as the new Princess of Wales. The images were pure storybook: a blushing bride in a dress with a 25-foot train, waving to crowds of cheering well-wishers. She was young, beautiful, and seemingly untouched by the cynicism of the modern world. The press dubbed her Shy Di, and the public adored her. Here was a princess they felt they could understand, a relatable young woman who had seemingly walked into a royal dream. For a moment, it appeared the monarchy had found its perfect modern heroine, a breath of fresh air for an ancient institution. But the fairy tale was a carefully constructed facade, and the reality behind palace doors was far more complex and painful. Diana brought with her an emotional transparency the royal family had never before encountered. She hugged AIDS patients when the world was gripped by fear and misinformation. She walked through active minefields to champion their removal. She spoke openly about her struggles with bulimia and postpartum depression, giving a voice to issues that were often shrouded in shame. This was a revolutionary approach to duty, one based on touch and empathy rather than distant ceremony. It forged an unprecedented bond with the public, who saw in her not just a princess, but a compassionate human being. Yet this very warmth created a fault line within the monarchy itself. Her marriage to Prince Charles, the heir to the throne, was under immense strain almost from the beginning. They were a mismatch of temperament and experience, a young woman craving affection paired with a man steeped in tradition and duty. The age gap of 12 years felt more like a chasm. The relentless media scrutiny, which Diana both mastered and was tortured by, turned their private difficulties into a public spectacle. Every glance, every absence was analyzed. The fairy tale narrative slowly unraveled, replaced by headlines of alleged infidelities, leaked tapes, and tearful confessions. Diana found herself trapped in a gilded cage of immense privilege and profound loneliness, her every move documented by a pack of paparazzi that grew more aggressive by the day. Her life became a paradox. She was the most famous woman in the world, yet she often described herself as desperately isolated. The princess, who had revived global fascination with royalty, was now illuminating its most painful contradictions, all while trying to raise two young princes in the eye of a perpetual storm. Her struggle was no longer just a personal one. It was a very public referendum on what a modern royal family should be. The tunnel under the Pont de l'Alma Bridge in Paris is just a short, curved underpass, a mundane piece of city infrastructure. On the last night of August 1997, it became the epicenter of a global shock. Princess Diana and her companion, Dodi Fayed, had dined at the Ritz Hotel, owned by Dodi's father. In an attempt to evade a swarm of photographers on motorcycles, their Mercedes sedan, driven by a Ritz security employee named Henry Paul, pulled away at high speed shortly after midnight. What followed was not a calm escape, but a frantic, high-speed chase through the heart of Paris. The paparazzi, desperate for a lucrative photo, pursued them relentlessly, their cameras flashing in the darkness. Inside the tunnel, traveling at an estimated speed of over 100 kilometers an hour. The driver lost control. The car swerved, collided head-on with a concrete pillar in the center of the roadway, then spun and smashed into the tunnel wall. The sound of crushing metal was deafening. Dodi Fade and driver Henry Paul were killed instantly. Diana, conscious but gravely injured in the back seat, was trapped in the wreckage. It took emergency workers over an hour to carefully cut her free from the mangled car. She was rushed to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, where surgeons fought for 2 more hours to save her life. The internal injuries from the violent impact were too severe. At 4 a.m. on August 31st, Princess Diana was pronounced dead. She was 36 years old. The news spreading with the dawn did not feel real. A world that had watched her grow from a shy bride into a global icon was suddenly, violently silenced. The disbelief quickly hardened into a profound, collective sorrow unlike anything seen in modern times. It was a grief that bypassed governments and protocols, flowing directly from the hearts of millions who felt they had lost someone they knew. At the gates of Kensington Palace, her London home, the public began to gather. They came alone, in pairs, in families. They brought flowers, thousands upon thousands of bouquets, until the iron gates vanished beneath a fragrant, colorful sea of tributes. They left handwritten notes, teddy bears, and candles that flickered in the night. This was not a state-mandated mourning. It was a raw, organic outpouring of love and loss for the woman they called the People's Princess. The sheer scale of the emotional response created an immediate and uncomfortable tension with the traditional monarchy. The royal family, at their Balmoral estate in Scotland, with Diana's grieving sons, Princes William and Harry, remained secluded. To a public weeping in the streets, the palace's silence, in the absence of a flag flying at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, felt like a cold, institutional snub. The outcry grew so loud that it forced a historic reversal. Queen Elizabeth II returned to London, addressed the nation on live television in a rare personal speech, and agreed to a flag flying at half-mast. The monarchy, for perhaps the first time, had to visibly bend to the public's emotional will. In the vacuum of clear information, conspiracy theories rushed in like a tide. Questions about the driver's blood alcohol level, the role of the pursuing photographers, and even the possibility of a darker plot orchestrated by those threatened by Diana's popularity or her relationship with Dodi, swirled for years. The official French investigation concluded it was a tragic accident, citing the driver's intoxication and excessive speed. A lengthy British inquest, which concluded in 2008, reached a similar verdict, stating that Diana and Dodi were unlawfully killed due to the grossly negligent driving of Henry Paul and the pursuing paparazzi. Yet for many, the shadow of doubt never fully lifted. Her death felt too narratively perfect, too symbolically resonant for a life already so defined by dramatic collision with the institution she married into. The princess, who had lived her entire adult life in the glare of the lens, ultimately died fleeing it. A final, terrible paradox that sealed her legend not just as a royal, but as the ultimate victim of modern fame. Her death in a Paris tunnel felt like the end of a modern fairy tale, but the story of the actress turned princess offered a different kind of narrative, one where the Hollywood dream seemed to become a permanent reality. Grace Kelly did not need to marry into royalty to be treated like a queen. By the mid-1950s, she was already Hollywood royalty, an Oscar-winning actress renowned for her cool blonde beauty, her elegant poise, and a series of iconic roles in films like Rear Window and High Society. She represented a glamorous, sophisticated ideal, a world away from the girl next door. Then, in 1955, she traveled to the French Riviera for the Cannes Film Festival and was invited to a photo session at the Palace of Monaco. There she met His Serene Highness, Prince Rainier III. He was a young sovereign ruling a tiny, picturesque principality that was more famous for its casino than its cultural prestige. Their courtship was discreet, a blend of genuine affection and strategic consideration. For Rainier, marrying a woman of Grace's global fame and impeccable reputation was a masterstroke, a way to put Monaco firmly on the world map. For Grace, it was a chance to trade the often shallow, demanding world of Hollywood for a role of lifelong purpose and stability. Their wedding in April 1956 was a global media event, a true merging of two powerful mythologies, cinema and monarchy. The world watched, enchanted, as the movie star became Her Serene Highness, Princess Grace of Monaco. It was the ultimate storybook ending, except it was only the beginning of her second act. The transition from film set to palace was profound. Princess Grace did not simply retire from acting. She meticulously crafted a new role, that of a modern consort. She applied a star's discipline to her royal duties, learning French and the complex history of the Grimaldi dynasty, and mastering the intricate protocols of European nobility. But her greatest impact was in revitalizing Monaco itself. She understood the power of image and culture. She founded the Princess Grace Foundation to support local artists, revived the Monaco Garden Club, and became the passionate patron of the Monte Carlo Ballet. Her mere presence transformed the principality's international reputation from a gambler's paradise into a center of refined arts and high society. She brought a touch of Hollywood glamour to state occasions, but grounded it in genuine work, tirelessly cutting ribbons, opening hospitals, and representing her new country with a warmth that felt both regal and authentic. Alongside this public life, she cultivated a private world as a mother to 3 children, Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie. She was determined to give them as normal an upbringing as possible within the palace walls, shielding them from the relentless press and instilling in them a sense of duty mixed with humility. For over 2 decades, Princess Grace seemed to have achieved the impossible, a seamless and happy life that balanced fairy tale expectation with tangible, meaningful contribution. The world saw a woman who had gracefully exchanged one crown for another, finding fulfillment in a role that appeared crafted just for her. This image of serene, perfected royalty made the sudden shattering of that September day in 1982 all the more incomprehensible. The road from La Turbie winds down the mountainside above Monaco, a route offering breathtaking views of the Mediterranean, but demanding a driver's full attention. On September 13th, 1982, Princess Grace was behind the wheel of her British racing Green Rover, with her 17-year-old daughter, Princess Stephanie, in the passenger seat. They were returning to the palace from their country home. It was a familiar drive, a moment of ordinary life for a woman whose existence was anything but ordinary. Without warning, something went terribly wrong. As the car navigated a sharp curve, Princess Grace suffered a catastrophic cerebral hemorrhage, a massive stroke. Her body went limp, her foot likely pressed down on the accelerator. The car swerved, crashed through a low stone wall, and plunged 45 feet down a steep, rocky embankment, tumbling end over end before coming to a crumpled rest in a garden below. The violent impact was witnessed by other drivers. Stephanie, though severely injured with a fractured vertebra, managed to crawl from the wreckage. Her mother, however, was unconscious and trapped, having sustained devastating head injuries. Emergency crews worked frantically to cut the princess free from the mangled vehicle before rushing her to Monaco's hospital. Surgeons operated for hours, but the damage to her brain was irreversible. She never regained consciousness. With her family at her bedside, life support was removed the following day, September 14th. Princess Grace of Monaco was pronounced dead. She was 52 years old. The news sent a tremor of disbelief around the globe. The woman who had embodied poised perfection, who had navigated the treacherous paths of fame and royalty with such apparent ease, had been felled by something as random and internal as a burst blood vessel. The world mourned not just a princess, but a lost icon of an elegant era. In Monaco, the grief was deeply personal. The principality she had helped transform into a beacon of culture felt her absence like a physical chill. Prince Rainier, heartbroken, would never remarry, ruling alone for the next 23 years, a monument to a love story cut short. For the world of cinema, her death felt like the final, poignant scene of her own film, a tragic end to a story that had seemed charmed. Her legacy became forever intertwined with sudden, shocking loss, a reminder that even the most serene fairy tales are vulnerable to the cruelest twists of fate. The princess who had traded a cinematic crown for a royal one left behind a haunting question. What more grace might she have brought to the world had that mountain road not curved the way it did? Their stories are woven from the same heartbreaking threads: youth, immense promise, and lives brutally cut short. Whether by the dangers of childbirth like Princess Charlotte, the random horror of a fire like Princess Marie, the consuming illness of Princess Amelia, the political violence that claimed Princess Mafalda, or the madness that enveloped Empress Carlota, each narrative ends with a chilling finality. These women, raised in palaces and draped in silk, possessed every material privilege imaginable. Yet their gilded worlds offered no true sanctuary from the universal human tragedies of accident, disease, betrayal, and loss. Their crowns could not shield them from a fever, a treacherous curve in a road, or a single, fateful spark. In this, their stories perform a profound alchemy, transforming distant figures from history books into achingly real people. They remind us that behind every grand title and painted portrait was a living, breathing individual with hopes, fears, and a heart that could break. These princesses who died too young force history to breathe, granting us a glimpse past the palace gates into the fragile humanity that power so often obscures. Their legacies are not just in the dynasties they failed to found or the policies they never enacted, but in the empathy they stir within us. So we turn the question to you: which of these stories resonated most deeply? Was it the national grief for Princess Charlotte, The Secret Fire of Princess Marie, or the modern tragedy of Diana? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this journey into the hidden heart of royalty compelling, subscribe for more deep dives into the lives that shaped our world.